Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakazagawa, and this is episode 112. Today's guest is Ross Sutherland. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. Today's guest is writer and podcaster Ross Sutherland. Ross Sutherland was born in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1979. He writes for film, radio, and stage and is the host, writer, and producer of the experimental fiction podcast Imaginary Advice, which won the 2018 British Podcasting Award for Fiction. Ross's radio work includes Make It Real, a documentary for BBC Radio 4 on British wrestling, The Signal Man, a retelling of Dickens's ghost story in a modern-day rail signal box, and The Escape Artist, a 10-part documentary on the poet-boxer Arthur Cravain, which aired on BBC Radio 3 in January 2020. Ross has 4 collections of poetry published by London Press penned in the margins. He runs poetry writing workshops with students of all ages, working with organizations including the Poetry Society, International Pen, National Portrait Gallery, and London Science Museum. Now, I have to say, Ross's show, Imaginary Advice, is one of my favorite shows in any genre. I first started listening a couple years ago when Helen Zaltzman featured one of his episodes on her show, The Illusionist. If I recall correctly, that episode involved Ross trying to train a neural net to do stand-up comedy, and it was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. And this is the thing. Every episode is unlike anything I've heard before because each episode goes in a completely different direction, sometimes involving essays, sometimes experimental fiction, sometimes poetry, sometimes a combination of all three. It's consistently one of the most innovative shows I know, and I always look forward to hearing a new episode. I've put a link in the show notes to the Imaginary Advice website, and I highly recommend checking it out. You can find it on all the major podcasting platforms. Also, if you enjoy our conversation and want to support Ross's work, I've included a link to his show's Patreon campaign, where for $5 a month, you can get the annual bonus episode, a copy of Ross's spoken word album, and the rewards go up from there. Speaking of Patreon, Ross was generous enough to add a new entry to the Keep the Channel Open bonus audio archive. He read his poem, The Prison Librarian. That joins readings by past guests including Leah Weezar, John Sands, Kia Brown, Marissa Crane, Liz Lenz, Rachel Zucker, and many more. Normally, the bonus audio archive is available to Patreon subscribers at the $5 level and above, but during the pandemic, I've opened up the full archive to the public, and you can find that at patreon.com/likewisemedia, and there's a link in the show notes for that. I'm not currently processing donations, but if you enjoy the show, you can still sign up to pledge, and when I restart the campaign, you'll be ready to go. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Ross Sutherland. Before we, say anything else, I did just want to say I really, really enjoy your show quite a lot. I'm not sure if this is like super common or what, but I found your show a couple of years ago through Helen Zaltzman's show when you did a feed drop on The Illusionist. And it was such a great experience, and it was something that was such a surprising experience. It wasn't like anything else I'd ever heard before, so I was really just immediately drawn into it. And what I think is one of the things that is so enjoyable about Imaginary Advice is that it remains surprising even after having listened for, about 2 years now. And, I used to always say when I think you've even seen me say this on Twitter before, that it doesn't sound like any other show. But the thing that is so kind of amazing to me is it kind of doesn't even sound like itself from episode to episode. It's always kind of changing. So I I think that was sort of where I wanted to start with was, how you've talked about this in other interviews before, how the show doesn't really have a format. But, from a writing perspective, that's really interesting to me, the way that it is not just experimental in terms of like, usually when people talk about experimental, they're talking about, subject matter or form or something like that. But there is an element of Imaginary Advice that feels truly like experimentation from episode to episode, so that the listener never really knows what to expect. And that makes it kind of exciting, Oh,
well, I'm so pleased you feel that way. I mean, some aspects of like that part of the show, it kind of evolved by accident. When I decided in the first place that I wanted to do a podcast, it was mostly just because at that point in my career, I'd been a writer for maybe like 12 years as a freelance writer by that point. And like being a freelance writer where you kind of do have to constantly evolve and change and mutate into different types of writer in order to just make enough money to pay the rent each month. And so I found myself already for several years in a situation where if I'd get an email and someone would say, could you write an article on this particular subject? Or then the next day it's like, could you come work on this play for me for a couple of weeks? That I would constantly have to be like switching these kind of hats on and off. And I looked back on the sort of work I'd created over the last sort of 10, 12 years. And there was no continuity. There was no through line through it. It was just like all this stuff. And so, yeah, starting a podcast in the first place was like, well, maybe I can kind of translate everything into audio, because audio, I don't know, it just sits in this lovely space between the page and the stage.
Yeah.
And and I just love that. And for me, it really, the more I kind of started this translation process, the more I just it seemed to be like this really lovely middle ground where, you'd still get that, like the intimacy of reading something, right? That kind of one-to-one kind of interaction. And I really love that. But then also you've just got all this kind of this extra instrument of your voice, which was something that I just always really valued doing stuff on stage. So even though I'd written maybe 3 books of poetry by that point, and about 5 or so plays, mostly kind of one-man show, spoken word type plays, and a bunch of articles, somehow all those disparate things could all be sort of synthesized into podcasting as a medium. So for me, it still felt like lots of things kind of coming together. In retrospect, of course, you look at that catalog and it does not have a format. And I was speaking about this the other day, but a radio commissioner who I kind of met once and who had listened to Imaginary Advice, was kind of not dismissive about it, but kind of couldn't understand it. And their main kind of feedback was well, if you don't have a format, you don't have a product. And I kind of felt a little bit hurt by that at the time, when I first heard that. But over time, I actually realized that, that's not such a bad thing, right? Because I guess I was never really trying to make a product in the first place. I was just thinking of Imaginary Advice and podcasting in general as an art form, and art doesn't need to be turned into products in order to justify its existence. Okay, it's fine for art not to fit that particular category. So, that's maybe helped solidify what I do in terms of being comfortable with it, just completely sort of changing form each time. And now that I've been doing it for so long, I've kind of, I've tried to sort of, there's no way back from that. I can't now suddenly just lock into a routine. I feel sort of compelled to keep trying to reinvent the form every time I do it. And it kind of reminds me of lots of the radio I used to like as a kid. I used to listen to John Peel's show on Radio 1, and every single one of his shows was always this kind of journey into the unknown. He'd be playing a punk rock song 1 minute, and then the next minute he's playing some kind of 1930s, "Oh, you were never lovelier" kind of song, and then it's into some sort of hardcore nosebleed techno, and you just go along for the ride. And I kind of wanted to emulate that a little bit. It certainly means that no one ever really happens upon my show by accident. It's just because I don't know what someone would have to Google to come up with it. But that makes me really grateful for when Helen Zaltzman reposted one of my episodes on The Illusionist. And I'm a huge fan of The Illusionist. It's just one of my favorite podcasts. And so to be able to sort of briefly appear on that show, I think was amazing for me. And and that's still, it's how it kind of slowly progresses. It's all word of mouth, I think.
Yeah. Helen is particularly great. She's such a supportive person in the podcasting community. And like you, I'm a big fan of her show. It's interesting, the thing that you were just saying about, if you don't have a format, you don't have a product, but then art not necessarily needing to be a product. It feels like one of those things where, when we think about art, we often think about it as being this sort of like, I don't know, creative purity kind of thing. But like, I think a lot of people who make art, and whether it's like a podcast or painting, like, there is still that sort of level of, needing to interact with a marketplace in some way, like unless you're independently wealthy and can just sort of do whatever you want. Like, yeah. I don't know, Picasso apparently, right, was already rich before he became famous. So, that's good work if you can get it, I guess. I don't know. It's a challenging thing, I find to be able to maintain that sort of, your sort of singular voice sometimes when there gets to be any kind of pressure to produce, Yeah.
I mean, that's a really, really good point. I agree. I think lots of people are kind of forced to kind of think of it like that. I wonder whether, like, for me, it feels slightly different only because the place that I started was poetry. And poetry is almost like it's outside the flow of capital. And, you may pour yourself, I mean, I don't like to, like even when I wrote poetry, like a lot of poetry, I still prefer to say I write poetry, not I am a poet. I always like the idea of verbing it rather than nouning it, just because it could have made more sense. I could say, well, it's an activity I do. Calling myself I am a poet sounds like I'm saying it's my job. And like, certainly no one is giving me the money to kind of do that. But like, I wonder whether that kind of like affected the way that I approach art, because I don't know how necessarily all poets do it, but usually there is a sort of sense that you do something which is kind of just like you make your money in something adjacent to your art form, and that underwrites the time which you spend actually doing the writing. It's also, I mean, another reason that I think it's so hard for me to work and think of my work as like a product is just that, like, my ideas at an idea level, at like a treatment level, are just like, no one would ever commission one of my treatments because I don't know what the end product is. All I have are the set of rules I'm going to follow to get me there. I don't know who said this. There's this, quote, and I use it all the time, and I can't even remember. I think it might have been like I heard like Billy Collins say it in like one of those, in like a podcast interview sometime. He said, like a poem tries to escape its own subject matter. I can't remember whether he said a good poem tries to escape its own subject matter or just a poem, but I really like that as a sort of North Star for thinking about creativity, in that, like, you might know what the front door is. You might know like where the poem is starting. And that might be something that's very, very clearly defined to you. But like, once you're kind of through that front door, you're following intuition and you're following these kind of language systems that you've set up to lead your thoughts in a place where you're not expecting them to go. And in fact, actually, the further you get from that starting place, like, the more interesting it becomes, and the more that becomes like a journey into yourself, like a kind of journey of exploration. Yeah. And so you can't necessarily, I don't know any of like the end, I don't know where a poem's going to go. And so I just think that makes my ideas just inherently unsellable, because I can't tell you what the thing is until it's made. And I think maybe because of that, my creative processes, they inherently have to turn inwards. It has to be some part of some kind of, I'd loathe to say spiritual practice, because that doesn't sound quite right to me. But yeah, I think I internalized writing as some kind of something closer to a meditative process of just spending time with myself and working out what I think. And that's just now so ingrained into me that I find it hard to flip back the other way and to think about the marketplace and whether anybody else would be interested in what I've got to say, because I think I know the answer. Yeah. But I'm lucky because I think when I first started as a poet, I think I was able to find adjacent stuff to writing, and then a lot of that was kind of teaching and doing kind of like dramaturg work, and that was the places where I tried to make the money, which I could then funnel into these insane, pointless follies that are my creative projects. Yeah.
I think, it's interesting to hear you talk about your writing process as, and this is something like I was listening to your interview on the Lunar Poetry podcast, and you had talked about, I think his name is David Turner. And this was a couple of years ago. You had talked about in a sort of similar way that approaching writing from a series of structures or rules. You talked about the Oulipo, and at that time you were writing a series of poems that were based out on a book of word searches, I believe. Yep. That's still in a folder on my computer. Yeah, it's interesting because it's such a different way of working than I do for one thing. But like one of the great things about getting to have a show like mine is that I get to talk to so many different people who, like, everybody has such a different approach. And this idea of not knowing where you're going is something that for me, it just feels terrifying, but it seems like a lot of your, when you were talking about the word search poems or talking about univocalisms, or even, I was thinking about some of the episodes of Imaginary Advice, like there was the Exquisite Corpse episode, which, and that was a collaboration. There's also the collaboration that you did, the 4 or 5 weddings and 1 or 2 funerals episodes, where you introduced the episode by talking about the rules that you had laid out for the collaboration. Like, this is going to be a game where we toss it back and forth, or this one is going to be a collaboration where we only get to listen to the last 10 seconds of the previous clip or something like that. What I find so interesting about it is that, like, for me, whenever I make anything, it ends up coming out of an observation that I want to dive into, right? Like, it's like I make an observation or I have a thought or a feeling, and then I want to describe it, and the work comes out of that. So it's always like finding my way to the point that I want to get, where this is like entirely the opposite of it, which is one of the things that makes it so fascinating to me, that you're starting from a form or a set of rules to generate this writing without knowing where you're going to go. And what is so kind of incredible about that is that a lot of the stories and things that you have done on Imaginary Advice still wind up feeling pretty profound. Like, they're often funny. Sometimes they're kind of ridiculous, but there is this sort of movement into the sublime that happens in most of the episodes. And being able to get there without knowing where you were going just seems wild.
Oh, it's really lovely to hear you describe it like that, Mike. To give you a kind of comparison, I think if I was trying to work the other way around, if I was starting with something I felt, and that was often like the inspiration point. Say I was, like I had a worry about a relationship with a family member, right? I was like, here is something, it's like me and this family member, and we are at odds about this particular idea. If like that was where I kind of like started, and I tried to write about that experience, just because I'm such an anxious person and someone who doesn't necessarily on the surface feel comfortable sharing their emotions. What I would do is I would immediately take that idea, even if it was like a simple idea, like a very simple raw idea, and I would complicate it. And I would complicate it and I would complicate it. And what would end up doing is I would just like bury it in language, until I felt like I'd encrypted that thought to such a high degree that it was now safe for me to share. And so I would go through this complete opposite process to a learning process. I would start with something I knew and then just like add bells and whistles to it. And like just turn it into this clown car. And, you know, and now it's like, okay, now no one knows what it is. You know, like I've kind of protected myself. I've made it kind of ambiguous and vague and overwritten enough that it's kind of safe. And I can tell you that's what I do because I've written poems like that before. And because I know I do that, I just know I can't start with the feeling. I have to actually start the other way. I have to start with the clown car. This just I just come up with this mess, you know, where it's just this trying to kind of like draw this make a little grid of chaos, you know, and that's what I guess why I was interested in making poems out of word searches, because they're literally a grid of chaos. But that's another reason why I like collaboration, because all right, immediately, right out of your own head, you're in this kind of weird thing where you're in this collaboration with someone else. You can't take control. You have to kind of cede control to someone else partly. So immediately, like, it kind of gets me out of my own head a little bit. But yeah, whatever rule system it is, whether it's, you know, and I've made like a play before where I play the audience the opening credits off The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air again and again and again. And every single time I play it, I'm adding like a new layer of interpretation as to what's happening. I'm kind of using Will Smith's actions on screen as kind of metaphors for various things. It's like he's acting out these little poems of mine. And as the cycle continues, by the time it gets like the 7th iteration, suddenly it becomes this very kind of like personal poem, me talking about like the death of my granddad. And it's the only way I could have got to that subject. I think I couldn't have just, without Will Smith's help, I couldn't have just stood up and gone, here's a poem about my granddad's funeral. I just wouldn't have done it. But I can use that process of just making writing impossible, you know, like trying to sort through nonsense, and through that process of kind of slowly clicking together thoughts, this kind of Rorschach blot slowly kind of forms in front of me. I mean, you mentioned like, yeah, the Oulipo, and like, this is very much like an Oulipian practice. It's this idea that I think if you make writing so hard for yourself, you know, like if you're trying to write a poem that only has one vowel in it, or something like that, just because the writing is made so hard, you just have to go deeper and deeper into yourself to try and find the solution. And somehow through that process, you end up revealing very personal things about yourself that you weren't expecting to. But because of the rules of the game, you don't really feel like you have a choice. You're like, well, I found a solution. It's a really personal, painful solution, but it's the only solution I've found. So that's what gets kind of like presented. And maybe if I'd just done that once or twice, I'd maybe think it was a fluke. But it seems to happen every time. I think if you just stare at just the white noise for long enough, eventually you see something in there which becomes like incredibly personal. It's just like a matter of time before that comes through.
It's interesting, you know, as you were talking, I had this little bit of a revelation about my own process, which is like one of the great things about getting to talk to other artists, is that, you know, the way you're talking about this is, you know, starting with a process and sort of exploring your way until you find an endpoint. And I was realizing that that the way that I work is like almost exactly the opposite, where I'm starting with an endpoint and then I'm looking for a process that lets me find the beginning.
Right.
That's I'm going to have to come back to that one on my own time. But you know, another thing that was making me think of is how, like, what ends up feeling urgent to me, right, is like not the work itself, but like in getting to the end point, right? And if I don't have that end point in mind, it's hard for me to focus enough, to feel motivated enough to find the process.
Gotcha. Yeah.
What I was thinking about though was, so like, I don't know if you know this, but I have another show that's on hiatus right now that involves, that's a storytelling show. I don't do the writing for it, right? I'm buying stories from other writers and then producing them as audio. one of the things that I was thinking about with this is that, some of your Imaginary Advice episodes are ones where you're not the writer or not the only writer or not the main writer. Some of them, you're not even the reader. You're like doing the production. And when I'm approaching someone else's story, I find it much easier to sort of problem solve it. Like, how am I going to score this? Where am I going to put in sound elements? Like, how am I going to make this sound in order to bring this out? In those cases, it is easier for me to start with the work instead of the end point. And I found that really interesting. And I guess I wanted to ask you, like, because you have some episodes where you are doing the writing and performing and production, some where you're just doing the performing and the production, and some where you're just doing the production, like, do those feel very different to you, or do they feel more similar? And also, like, do you feel like you get something similar out of them, or do they satisfy sort of different kinds of creative needs for you?
Wow, that's a good question. And I think it's tricky. I think, so something I really love about the episodes where I do everything, like, I'd say like an aspect of Imaginary Advice that I try to always keep in play. I wouldn't say every episode does this, but I always try to create episodes where there is both a kind of creative fiction part and also an essay part. And sometimes those different sort of pieces are kind of clearly delineated, and then sometimes they're kind of less clearly delineated. I'd say most of the times when I'm trying to write like a short story, I'll try to include an essay in it somewhere, a little bit like I've just like hidden some like large footnotes within the story. And similarly, if it's like an essay episode, I've usually got like a point where I've got one of my poems that I want to kind of like just like insert into the middle of the essay, a little bit like a dream sequence or something. I like that because I like the idea of both being in the creative work and simultaneously outside it as well. I like being both film and commentary track at the same time, because I kind of feel that like those two aspects, they can fit together in interesting ways. They don't have to be kept like separate in, like church and state kind of things. They can sort of bleed into each other. And I like when they kind of bleed into each other. So that's something that's important to me. And one of those episodes is like, I do like being able to simultaneously make something from the inside and outside. And I think that helps, like we were talking about before, with stuff like doing weird things with form. Like, I like being able to both simultaneously present the work, but then also let the listener kind of ride sidecar with the author as they're going through the process of making it. So the audience isn't positioned at this kind of at the finish line as the sort of as the work kind of like finally kind of reaches its end point. They're kind of going with the author along the way, sort of actually observing the problems that they're having and trying to fix them. So that kind of inside and outside thing is something I care about a lot. The episodes where I don't do all the jobs, I think, is really, really useful, because I think it does make it a lot easier for me to focus in on a particular task and think about that. So yeah, I really love it when I get to have like a guest writer come on, and I'm able to just see what Imaginary Advice feels like purely from a kind of production perspective. I've had the poet and writer and podcaster Tim Clare on the podcast several times, and he's written stories specifically for Imaginary Advice. And not only do I just like love all of Tim's work, but it's also really interesting to see what Tim thinks an Imaginary Advice story sounds like or feels like, like, because he's still trying to do that in the writing form. And I think that does help me. It helps me learn about the podcast a lot by seeing, what people have sort of prepared to bring in. So yeah, the individual, like being able to sort of occasionally like take off my kind of essay hat or take off the story hat or just get a break from being the performer. Yeah, it really does help me a lot. It's something that only recently I've been able to kind of do or do more of, because it's it's a bedroom produced show. Like, from many years, I pretty much could only be the only person involved in it at any point because I had no money to pay anybody else to do anything, and I was having to make it around my other jobs. So I was kind of mostly making the show, like in the middle of the night and at weird times of day. So it now feels great to reach a point where I can share the load and actually be outside the show for once, rather than just this kind of simulated version of me being outside it. Yeah.
I find the way that like production on a show works. First of all, I added my storytelling show after having done this show for several years, and I thought, I know what I'm doing. This will be no sweat, and then not really realizing how much more work it was going to end up being. I thought, I'm not writing it; it'll be easy. But a lot, I very much, even having produced a whole show for like 3 years, I completely underestimated how much extra work it is to, when you're doing scoring and sound design, it's really quite a different beast. And one of the things that I find so difficult about all of that is knowing, like if you're writing, you have one thing you can do with writing, right? Like maybe two things. Like you got words, right? You've got words and you've got white space, and that's pretty much it, right? Punctuation, I guess, right?
Right.
But when you're doing audio, you've got music, you've got sound design, you've got different kinds of layering, you've got silence, which I think is the thing that a lot of people sort of miss, but it's such an important thing. And it just multiplies and multiplies and multiplies. It's really hard to figure out how to do what's right, because,
oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yeah. I always when I'm thinking about music and sound design, they obviously add a lot to a piece, but also both of them can be very manipulative. And I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about how do you find the right way, the way into how do you find the right balance of that, cause your sound design, first of all, it isn't like other people's sound design. Like more and more, I'm listening to more, sort of experimental sound kind of shows, largely because of the stuff that you're doing. But your show still has a sound that isn't like anything else that I know of. And it always seems to hit this right balance where it doesn't ever feel cheap. Sometimes when people are doing things with sound and especially music, it can feel really cheap, right? It can feel like they're kind of pulling you in a certain direction.
Right. It's a little bit like when you watch a TV show and then suddenly it's a sad moment. So suddenly you've got this kind of these kind of epic strings kind of building in the background and you're like, yeah, I got it. Thanks. But yeah, gosh, it's funny, isn't it? Out of curiosity, Mike, have you had a particular Foley that you've made that you would what's the hardest sound you've ever had to sort of construct? Cause I just lose half a day sometimes, trying to come up with, I remember once I had to do a bus in Italy that was out of control. And I lost my mind trying to there's about 20 different sounds that I've kind of just found in various places that I'm trying to sound together. And I was just I go too far overboard in thinking about it.
I don't know what too far overboard is. I would tell you probably car sounds are one of the ones that feel very difficult for me. And I was working on a story for my other show. And it's a beautiful story. It's a very sensitive story. It's about a young, Mexican family, a young woman who loses her mom in a car accident, but that's in the story. And I probably did 12 different variants of traffic noises or no traffic noises, put in a car crash or don't and it's sometimes I remember I worked on this one version for a really long time and I thought, oh, this is going to be it. And then when I listened back to it a couple of days later, I was like, ooh, I don't know, that seems a little insensitive. I don't know. It just took me forever.
I think actually that's it. I think you hit the nail on the head there, because right? I think sound effects, just like acting in audio form, if you listen to certain schools of thought on this type of thing, like people think like, oh, well, it's audio, so they can't see me. I'm invisible, so I have to go twice as big in order to paint this picture, right? I need to really, really like paint the scene with my words and my intonation. And of course, like that doesn't work because these people are invisible. We're just so hypersensitive to voice that we can immediately like spot a liar, right? It's just like, I mean, unless someone is like an incredible actor, very expressive performances kind of tend to sort of read false. And that's why I think for lots of the times when I've worked with guests on Imaginary Advice, I'm always kind of saying, listen, just like really dial it down, like actually try to just monotone it, because I guarantee even your monotone is going to be so rich and full of like information that we'll hear that information, like, because we're listening so closely to your voice. You're literally whispering in our ears. So we're going to be able to really identify what you feel about that, even if you're trying to kind of withhold it from us. And I guess sound effects must just be like an extension of that same thing. It's very easy to get into a situation where it feels like too much. And I think, yeah, often what I'm doing in my own stories is like, I think like my first draft has like a lot more Foley in it and a lot more music, which you might find hard to believe because I know they're still pretty wall to wall. Then it's just like stripping that all out again a couple of days later and kind of being like, oh, okay, well, I said it, so I don't need to Foley it. Similarly, it's just like, well, rather than having like this big music cue here, what if this is the moment that like all the rest of the sound cuts out and you're, like, and suddenly, like, for the first time in like 10 minutes, there's actually some silence.
I'm wondering, like, is this something that you've had like any kind of training in, or, cause like for me, I just sort of stumbled in. I did have like one kind of class, like where we made multimedia slideshows when I was in college. Those many years ago. But, for the most part, what I've learned how to do has mostly just been from listening to other people, how they do it, which sometimes seems like a good way to do it, but sometimes seems very inefficient.
Yeah, no, I think I'm the same. No, I think I've just like listened to things and heard things that I like. And I think maybe because Imaginary Advice itself as a text is kind of changing genre and form quite a lot. I think I kind of had to find a sort of an additional like sound language to help separate those different sections, or to sort of make it clear when we were transitioning from sort of one mode of speaking to another mode of speaking. So yeah, I think probably the sound design I do is very sort of specifically related to the challenges that Imaginary Advice gives me. But then I think sometimes maybe that weird skill set, when it just gets applied just to working on like a story, ends up having like a slightly unusual tone to it because of that. But I'm trying to think who I like. I guess I sort of, I don't. That's a really tricky question, because I think maybe much to sound designers' chagrin, I think that we absorb so much of that without even realizing that we're doing it. Right? It's sometimes like when it's good, we just completely internalize it, and it's just it becomes so kind of tied into the architecture of a story. And I'm talking here about whether that's in drama or on film or TV, that you kind of only really notice it when it's bad. A lot of the time you're like, oh, gee, what's this? Or like my wife's better at noticing it actually, when she's just like, it's been the same piano note for the last 7 minutes. Like, when are they going to change this up? And I think a lot of time I just don't notice, but hopefully that still means we're kind of absorbing it subconsciously on some level.
That is, for me, I think the biggest difficulty is, my first pass through anything, I'm always, the music is always too loud. everything is a little bit too noticeable. And I always get worried, like, well, if I don't make it loud enough, then people won't hear it. But it's like, well, do you really want people to notice that, or do you want them to be thinking about the story? And I guess that's the challenge. You don't want to kind of get too clever and get in your own way.
Yeah. For a long time, when I was doing much more like live theatrical stuff, I really got into using kind of videos with my poetry. You know, like I would have made a video myself or worked with like a video artist. So when I read this poem, there was this video behind me that kind of synchronized with what I was saying. And it kind of worked nicely in, you know, lots of kind of environments, but often when I would kind of take that to a more of like a serious poetry night and I would do it, the kind of feedback I tend to get with is just kind of like, oh, well, you know, poetry is it's this beautiful, sensitive art form. Like the poem itself should be doing all this work for you. So why are you kind of layering up all this kind of other stuff on top of it all? You know, like it's, you're kind of strangling the art form by just like adding all this kind of media to it. And like, I see the point, but also it's just like, well, yeah, this is like a different art form. And this is in this art form, there's two channels speaking to you at once. And granted, it would be pointless if I said the word apple and then an apple appeared on the screen behind me. It's just like, yeah, look, they know what an apple is, Ross. You don't need to illustrate it. But, you know, if I said the word apple and I don't know, like this is going to sound terrible, but let's say planet Earth appears like behind you. Okay, now you're adding like a layer to it, right? The video is like simultaneously like interpreting the poem and responding to it. So it's like an additional layer of kind of metaphor, instantaneous metaphor, because you're saying one word and seeing something else at exactly the same time. And that's interesting. That is, it's not meant to be something that's simplifying the text. It's complicating it. And as long as that's the case, you know, I think that it can be used as something which is interesting. Like the video should be an art form in its own right. Like sound design should be like an art form in its own right. I know I've now just like immediately contradicted myself by just a couple of minutes ago saying that like good sound design is invisible, but I don't know. There we are. Both of those things are simultaneously true, I think.
I mean, a lot of art is living in the contradictions, right?
That's right.
It's really funny. What you're saying is exactly the argument I have had in sort of the opposite direction, because I like first came up in the art community as a photographer, and in photography, and in particularly in fine art photography, photographers are real purists about like just the image. Like if it needs anything else, then you're a bad photographer and it's a bad photograph. And I was like, but is it like, cause you know, being a writer also, I have a real interest in trying to take words and images and put them together and doing exactly the thing that you're saying. Like it can't just be that the words are a caption or the image is just an illustration of the words. You have to have each thing doing its own thing. But if you are doing that, what's the problem with it? What's surprising to me is that I had this impression of poets as being a little less dogmatic than photographers. Like photographers are very, very conservative as a rule. They're very concerned with, is this or is this not a photograph?
Oh no!
And most of the ones that don't do that, they don't call themselves photographers. They'll just call themselves artists. You know?
Right. Yeah. No. Same over on this side. Yeah. God. Yeah. They're just as bad. Yeah. Yeah. And it's a shame. It's a shame, isn't it? Right? Because actually, like all the interesting stuff, for me at least, happens at like the intersection between two art forms. You know, I think where one art form like talks to another, it, you know, like immediately provides this kind of interesting series of kind of contrasts and contradictions and similarities, right? Like I think it's just this placing these two mirrors side by side to sort of see what they make of each other. It's like immediately like a really fascinating area to work. And this idea of this kind of dogmatic purism in terms of protecting the sort of like the limitations of the art form Is that something that is kind of more sort of like stamped through academia? It possibly is.
Maybe.
I don't know. Yeah.
Oh man.
Very nice.
Well, I think we need to take a little break and we'll come back and do the second segment.
Cool.
For the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
I was thinking about this in advance quite a bit, Mike. It was a little bit hard because all my thoughts right now, they tend to kind of immediately split into two categories. And like one category are like thoughts that quickly chain together into kind of end of the world anxieties. And then other thoughts are just kind of distracting thoughts that I end up feeling ashamed about because, I really should be doing something about the thoughts in category one. But, so what I want to talk about is something quite stupid and petty, but it is something that I wanted to pick someone's brain about because sometimes I feel like there's something wrong with me and I need a second opinion, right? And that's, it's my absolute failure to ever make it through a single YouTube yoga class. And this is connected to language still. I think it is still connected because I feel deep down my inability to do this is in some way still connected to my own anxieties about comprehension and poetry and teaching and kind of stuff like that. But it's coming up now. I think very soon it's going to be 5 months since I've left the house. Right. And, I've been trying to come up with things to help keep me active. And I thought yoga would be a good one because I'm stuck inside and I'm 40 now. And I spent my entire 20s touring, which meant sleeping on sofas. So my back and joints, not good. Do you, before I go any further in my rant, do you do yoga or have you ever done yoga?
I have. It's not something that I have, had a ton. It's not like a regular thing for me. I mean, I've gone to a class or two in my life and I typically don't enjoy it very much.
Right. Yeah.
It's funny because, I actually just recently, I was taking a mindfulness based stress reduction class, not because I felt very stressed or anything, which oddly you'd think I would, given, everything.
the end times. Yeah.
Yeah. And part of that involves meditating and part of it involves, doing sort of basic yoga. So I've done probably more in the past little, maybe 8 weeks or so than I have in the previous 8 years. But even that's not much. I wouldn't call myself a yoga practitioner.
Got you. I wonder, because similarly, I think part of it was about, trying to find some way of slowing down my thoughts. I had more positive results with jigsaws. Actually, I've never been a jigsaw person before, but I started having a jigsaw on the go on the dining table. I found is better because then, if I just want to take 5 minutes and just think about weird abstract shapes, I can kind of just go do that. And I find that quite good for just at least emptying my head for a second. But yeah, I thought yoga would be good. I've never ever done it before. And I think that's part of the problem is experiencing, being taught something for the first time through a screen. And I think there is a particular compatibility problem between yoga and, and YouTube. And I think an important thing, and weird enough, this is also how I feel about poetry on the page. But when you're dealing with a YouTube tutorial, right? If someone is trying to teach you something over YouTube, whether it's how to cook something or how to do something on your computer, the ability to be able to stop and start it is so important. I don't want to be on rails trapped to do things in real time. So I that ability to pause something, go back, I missed that stage, do that again, right? That ability to move back and forth on the sort of on that fourth axis is so important to being able to use videos in that way. And I feel the same way about a poem, right? On a poem on the page, I want to be able to move forward and back. I don't necessarily want to be, particularly if it's a complicated poem, something that's important. I want to be able to loop like a computer program Florian Kramer's got this great essay comparing poetry and computer programs about how they both, they have like looping inside it. You kind of move forward and back in a program. Similar kind of thing, right? Same in poems, same in YouTube tutorials. But then I think in like yoga, you just can't do that, right? You can't be both simultaneously like doing the pose and then also like stopping and starting it again. And I get the impression that yoga instructors, like they don't have a lot of control over time either, even though, and I will stress, like, I talked about 6 videos, and every single one of them, they are like the absolute basic beginners. This is for people who don't even know what the word yoga means, right? It's for like, this is class 1, day 1 stuff, right? And every time it's the same. They'll do the first bit, they'll teach you how to sit down, and they'll teach you how to breathe, and they'll do that really, really slowly, because at that point in time, there's no conflict between the content and the form. But then as soon as they get into the actually doing yoga, like they have to kick back into their normal speed again. And I guess that's because yoga's connected to breathing, right? So they can't slow down that much because that means they can't breathe. I think in order for a yoga instructor to go slow enough for me to be able to understand it, they would have to go so slow that they would just simply suffocate. Like they would not be able to kind of get through it. So like that's a problem. I think I'm stuck on this timeline. They're stuck on this timeline. And I feel that the problem has to be like language at the end of the day. And what it really like reveals to me is just how important language is to all forms of kind of like of kind of teaching. And I feel like specifically important in yoga, like they can't slow down. So the words that they give to describe what they're doing have to be so incredibly precise. They have to use metaphor, right? They have to use kind of like symbolic language in order to kind of do it because they're stuck doing it at this particular speed. But it's a very difficult poem that they have to pull off because it has to be synchronized to their movements. It has to be so precise that I can follow it. And not only that, like there has to be like 0% possibility of misinterpretation, which could mean that I would like, twang out my neck and then I can't look left for 10 days, right? Like so can I, to explain, right, can I give you an example, right? I don't know if we'll be able to, because I wrote this down. I kind of went back and I kind of wrote down because I think it's easier. So like a lot of moves, like I can't even be looking at the screen for doing it because this is a move that you've got to be looking at the floor. So at that point, like their voice is like all I have to go on. All right. Now I'm going to read this to you. All right. And see if you can work out what movements are supposed to be like happening. Right. So we're going to head into a lunge now. Right. If you know what a lunge is, you're already ahead of me. All right. So we're going to head into a lunge now. So whenever you're ready, you'll meet me with the right foot forward and the left foot back. Take your time, nice and slow. We're going to get into your body and start to explore. So when you arrive there, the front toes are going to be pointing forward, lower the back knee so you can find some spaciousness through the front body. Chances are we're rounding here. She's not pointing, because I don't know where we're rounding. Right? Chances are we're rounding here because of culture tightness. So in time, we'll keep that back knee lowered. So in time, we'll slowly come up onto our fingertips. We'll slowly come out of our turtle shell. I didn't know we were in a turtle shell. Move shoulder blades down the back body, lift the heart. We are active and we are aware. Don't dump weights into your legs. Find the energy in your midline again, almost a scissor effect. Spike the left heel, and again with that scissor effect, take one deep breath in. Exhale, plant the palms, knee back down. Take the rest. It could be child's pose or just the knees. Please don't tell me that made perfect sense to you.
It didn't make entire sense to me, but like I say, I'm not a yoga practitioner. Some of the phrases I did find familiar because I've heard them before, but no, I wouldn't. You know what this is reminding me of is, and it's interesting that you're bringing up the language part because, well, first of all, the way that you were reading that, I could imagine this becoming an imaginary advice.
Yeah, maybe.
But the thing that is very difficult for me, and I've never known if this is because I'm weird or if it's because the things are weird, I've always suspected it was just that I'm weird because, well, I am. But everybody else seems to just kind of get it. Is that when it comes to doing things with my body, it's not that I'm uncoordinated or anything like that. It's that I have no concept of how to apply metaphorical language to a body feeling, how to interpret the one into the other. And the thing about yoga that like, I can't imagine doing it from a video. Like the only way that I've ever gotten any kind of thing right in yoga is because the instructor walked across the classroom and physically put their hands on my body and moved me so that I was doing the right thing. And then I was like, oh, that's what it's supposed to feel like. And this reminds me so much of two things, actually. One was when I was in high school and college, I did choir and I did musical theater. And both of those involved a very similar thing. I have this very clear memory in high school of my choir director. And I'd never taken voice lessons. I like to sing, but I'd never taken a formal voice lessons, right? I just sort of learned as I was going. And she would say these things like, you don't come up to the note. You have to come down onto it. You have to go up over it and then come down onto it. And I was like, what the hell does that mean? And I was like, and like everybody else in the whole choir was like, oh yeah, okay. Yeah. That's what you're supposed to do. And I'm like, what does that mean? What does that feel like in your voice? Like, what?
Yeah. That's it. That's exactly it. And it's almost like once they've learnt it, or once they've attached the thing to it, like they just can't understand anyone who doesn't know that. And it's like someone going, oh, how do I ride a bike? And someone goes, well, you ride a bike. That's it. Like step 1, ride the bike. Step 2, stop asking stupid questions. And it's like, but I don't, like that gap, like exactly that gap between like the ability of words and sense, ability or, like is like vast. And I think it happens all the time. And actually like yoga makes me feel like, it makes me feel stupid and it makes me feel like angry and humiliated. Because, it's like everybody in the room laughing and I don't get the joke. Like, you feel immediately like at odds. And funny enough, that's how I felt about cooking for years, like as well. Like a really sort of similar thing where like I came to like learning how to cook late. The simplest of things I would still, like I would need someone to show me, like it's because cooking still also comes down to physical, like actions, small physical actions. And I don't know. Is the problem that other people, that this idea of like fake it till you make it is more of a thing and that like people are just like, yeah, I know what that means. I know how to come down onto a note or, and, the idea is just like, well, eventually I'll work it out, like after I've said that I can do it for 5 years, one day it will kind of click. Or I don't know. Yeah. Like I don't know why other people just don't seem to have like bad emotional reactions to these kinds of things that I do. But I think it is. I think it's often it's a translated anxiety, which I think actually comes from writing as well, which is what happens when you take a poem, and you flatten it out onto a fourth timeline, like where suddenly the audience doesn't get to sit with a poem on the page and interrogate it and just like meditate on it and like hold the entire poem in their head and work out what it means. Suddenly, no, we are stuck in, like in 4-dimensional space and the poem has been flattened out. And you just get one chance, one moment to get it, and then it's kind of gone, and we're kind of on to the next. So actually, sometimes when I read a poem and I come off, and there's, some people be like, "Oh, I really like that poem," and then there's one guy who's like, "I didn't get that at all. I had no idea what was going on." I'm like, that's yoga me right there, and like, and I relate to that. I feel like maybe he's the only person being honest.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It is such a weird thing. I have spent so much of my life for exactly things like this, feeling very strange and kind of isolated because of it. And, part of this is just like, I've always just had an assumption. I mean, this is something that I've mentioned before, but people sometimes who know me from, if people know me as a podcaster or as a writer or an artist or something, then they're often surprised to know that what my day job is electrical engineering. And people who know me in my work context are surprised that I would do anything creative, because those two things don't really, most engineers are very, very literal, and very sort of sequential in thinking. And this is also a thing for me. Growing up, I was the one in the family that everybody would make fun of for like answering a question. I remember there was this time my she wasn't my sister-in-law yet, but my then girlfriend's older sister was describing me to someone as like, if you show him a glass of wine and say it's half full, he'll say, no, it's actually 0.478% full. And, that also made me feel a little weird, but this whole thing about not knowing how to come down onto a note was always it was just like another thing where it was like, I don't know what that means. Everyone else seems to know what that means. And this must just be one of those things where I'm being literal again, and I don't know how to think about things metaphorically. And I think for me, this is actually something that really drives my creative impulses at all. My urgency and creativity has always been to form some kind of connection between me and any other person. Yeah. I don't know if I would have felt that if I didn't spend so much of my young life feeling like a weirdo,
I think I so relate to that instinct, like the instinct to, like not to accept the truth as it is told to you, but to actually understand it. You're like, okay, well, you said the glass is half full, but what do you mean? And taking like the language as it is presented to you, and then just like pulling it apart to see how it works. Actually that feels to me like such a critical part of poetry, which is the sort of like, which is both to create poetry, but also to be like antagonistic to poetry as you find it, like in the world where like, where a word is used in substitution, to go like, okay, but why that choice? And what does that mean? I feel like, I totally, relate to that. And maybe that, so maybe it is a sort of sense of like, that comes from, at some point, like a sense of alienation, of feeling like the language we're speaking is slightly different to the language that everybody else is speaking, and just like actually wanting to get into that sort of negative space between our thoughts and their thoughts, and just like play around with it and work out what's going on.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of times especially when I was young, metaphors and sort of shortcuts in speech would sort of flummox me. But even, I think I tend to, with having a little more life experience, get a little more understanding quickly these days. But the ones that do tend to stymie me even still are ones that relate to having a body, I spent so much of my youth like trying to be outside of my body. Like I would read, and when I would read, I would be so engrossed in the book I was reading that I wouldn't notice people coming in like a foot away from me and talking to me.
Yeah. And
so this whole thing about like another experience that I was remembering was when I was in college, and we were doing a production of Guys and Dolls, and they brought in this movement coach who taught Alexander technique, which I don't really know what Alexander technique is, except for that it seems to involve like getting massages or something. I don't know what exactly it was, but I remember her telling me to walk across the room as though I had a pin coming out of my head and I was hanging from a string from the top of my head down. And I thought, what does that mean? What does that feel like? But like, it was also the kind of thing that, again, everybody else seemed to understand what it meant. And when I finally did get it, like when I finally did sort of start moving the way that she wanted me to move, I don't know how I managed to get it. Might have just been an accident. Then the metaphor made perfect sense. But for the first like hour or so, I was very confused. I feel like this connection between being in the mind and being in the body, that's something that's always been very challenging for me. I've always been much more of an in my head kind of person. And, which is also why I'm a terrible actor, because I was too much thinking about things instead of like just being, which like a good actor is just in the moment, and it's just, not even really thinking about it. And it's not something I was ever good at, but for me, and it's interesting, to bring this back to the yoga thing, that yoga is, at least my understanding of it, a practice that is supposed to be bringing your mind and body closer together. So how to do that with language seems, I don't know, not just difficult, but potentially fraught,
Right. That's it. Okay. Maybe that's it. Yeah. But language is just immediately sending me into my head. And also, yeah, it's just like it's impossible to use, like poems just by their ambiguity, of course, like contain multiple worlds inside them, right? And so if you're using figurative language, you're immediately creating this ambiguity into these shapes you're pulling, which are meant to be, which can be dangerous, right? It can be if you pull that shape wrong. And so suddenly to be trapped in a situation where words are like all we have to go on makes things so much harder, right? If there's not someone to literally adjust your body and reconnect that word to that like feeling. Yeah, there's no way around that. And so I don't know what I'm going to do. I guess, I guess maybe I have to start somewhere simpler.
Oh man,
that's okay. It's just good to talk about it, just because, yeah, I just kind of felt like I was going a bit odd.
I think it would be very frustrating, and it does to me kind of point at the, the inherent, like language, all language is a metaphor, right? So if you don't have the reference point, it's hard to make meaning out of it at all.
Yeah.
That might have been a little more philosophically heavyweight than I intended it to be.
I liked it. No, it was good.
Well, so there's one question that I like to end with, and that is, if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Yeah, there's something that I found. I found it around kind of the start of lockdown. I was always a huge fan of the poet David Berman. Poet, also musician. He was the linchpin. He was the band, the Silver Jews. Also, he was an illustrator as well. David Berman died in, I think 2019. And, I found on SoundCloud, this, recording that he did with a live band, at a club in Bloomington. Second Story, I think. And he's kind of like opening for the band. The band are on stage. The band are The Impossible Shapes. And like David Berman's come on stage to kind of read a poem to kind of warm up the band. So they're kind of jamming behind him as he's playing. And I don't know whether it's like a single poem or whether it's just kind of random pages from his notebook, because it kind of has that kind of feel to it. It feels just like this. I mean, all David Berman poems have that kind of feel to it. They are just like mapping these kind of landscapes, and they go in different places. But because I'd always loved his poetry, and his poetry was really important to me. He was just, his book, Actual Air. I just lived in my bag for about like a decade. It's just like so completely torn apart now. And lots of the other poets who were my friends, like he just became part of our own kind of like secret language, like we knew those poems so well. And I loved his personableness in his poems. He was capable of these incredibly detailed, rich, like abstract descriptions, a description that would be so detailed it would become surreal just by having so much information inside it. And yeah, capable of really odd, beautiful, abstract phrases, but then also like this incredibly prosaic touch, like he was, I always say like something I think I always admire in an artist when I find like a new artist, like my first thought is always, oh, I didn't know we were allowed to do that. And, you know, and he would often like end, you know, I don't know whether this is actually me quoting one of his poems, but it's this kind of thing that he would often have like a really detailed verse. And then like at the end of it, he'd just add a line like, well, you know, the kind of thing I'm trying to say here. And I just love, and I love that. And I feel that does sort of suggest to me that like he's one of these poets that's moving towards cognition, not away from it. You know, like he's trying to connect dots, and he's not afraid to step out of the poem and and gonna talk to you from the sidelines and then get back into the poem and try to do some more of it. So he was really important to me, and it was so tragic to hear of his passing and to find this recording of him that like I'd never heard before, and I didn't think existed in like text form anywhere. From me kind of like scouring the internet looking for any other poems that he wrote after his book. So when I started lockdown, I kind of just started like transcribing the recording, with the idea being that maybe when it was finished, I'd be able to kind of put it online, and it would just be this new piece of David Berman's writing, which could then be sort of shared with others and other fans of his work. And I ran into some difficulties in it because there's some parts where he gets like drowned out by the music, which kind of rise and falls. And there's some bits, it's not a great recording, so you can't always hear what he's saying. So I kind of asked other people I knew, musicians and poets, people I knew who were fans of his work, to contribute to this project. And so slowly we've been putting it together. And, it's not, there's some parts that I think are almost impossible. And so you kind of have to like dream yourself into those spaces. And as a result, like I know it's never going to be an authentic David Berman poem anymore. It's always going to be like a collaboration between various people who like his stuff and him. But that's made me really happy over this kind of weird lockdown period. Like just a nice chance to sort of return to one of my favorite poets and to, you know, have this kind of weird archaeological project of kind of restoring something that was lost. So that's made me really happy.
Oh, that's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really had a good time.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, man.
All right, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes to Imaginary Advice and to Ross's Patreon campaign. Do check those out. And hey, if you end up liking it, and if your tastes are anything like mine, I suspect you will, go leave a review for Imaginary Advice on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. Every little bit helps. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help on this episode is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, the best things you can do are tell a friend, share the episode on Twitter, and tag us at ChannelOpenPod, and leave a review on Podchaser. There's a handy link in the show notes where you can do just that. You can find all of our social media information, transcripts, email newsletter, and show notes at keepthechanneleopen.com. And hey, you know, you can also always just tweet at me at ChannelOpenPod, or you can send me an email at podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com and let me know that you liked the episode. Let me know what you liked about it. I always enjoy hearing from listeners. If you're interested in listening to some excellent and diverse fiction, you can check out my other show, Likewise Fiction, where I read outstanding short stories by authors including J.Y. Young, Amal El-Mukhtar, Rachel Lyon, Sarah Hollowell, and more. You can find that wherever podcasts can be found or at likewisefiction.com. Keep the Channel Open will be back on August 12th with a conversation with writer Matthew Salises, so stay tuned for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.